Hey, 6th grade. Now we're going to get started on another vocabulary video lesson, whatever. So our first vocabulary word is base. And a base is the factor that is repeatedly multiplied in an exponent. Expression. All right, so make sure you get that in your notes. The base is the factor that is repeatedly multiplied in an exponent expression. So an example of that would be something like this. Let's get my pen going here. Let's go with green again. All right, so let's say we had 2 to the 3rd power. That also equals 2 times 2 times 2, which equals 8. The 2 is the base. A non-example would be something like 6 to the 4th power, and this little guy right here, that is not the base. You don't want that. That's not what you're looking at if we're talking about the base. So make sure you get that in your notes. All right, your next vocabulary word is exponent, right there. The number of times the base is multiplied by itself, that's an exponent. So here's a common mistake that people make when they're using exponents. This will probably be more just a little fun fact for you. Let's say you have 6 to the 4th power. A common mistake that people make is they'll just assume they're supposed to write this as 6 times 4, which equals 24. Totally not the case. It's really supposed to be 6 times 6 times 6 times 6, because 6 is the base, 4 is the exponent, so that means we have to multiply 6 by itself 4 times. 6 times 6 times 6 times 6. Also, the exponent is always written smaller and in the upper right-hand corner of the base. So an example of an exponent could be something like 4 to the 2nd power, which means we're going to multiply the base, which is 4, by itself, multiply it by itself 2 times. So we would have 4 times 4, which equals 16. That means that 2 is our exponent. And a non-example of this would be something like, if we had 5 to the 3rd power, 5 is the base. 5 is not the exponent. So make sure you get all of that in your notes. All right, fraction is our next vocabulary word, and the definition of a fraction is the representation of a part of a whole object, set, or unit. Get all that in your notes. A fraction is the representation of a part of a whole object, set, or unit. A little fun fact about fractions is that benchmark fractions are common fractions you use to estimate the value of fractions. 0, 1/2, and 1 are all examples of benchmark fractions. So an example of a fraction, and I know you guys already know these things, but we're going to go for it anyway, could be something like this. We're going to divide it into fifths, sort of evenly. Can't be too picky. All right, 1/5, 1/5, 1/5, 1/5, 1/5. So there's our box that is all divided into 5 equal parts. Well, if we're supposed to shade 3/5 of this, we would color in 1, 2, and 3 boxes, 3 of the 5 boxes. So there are 5 parts in the whole, and 3 parts are shaded. So that shows 3/5. If we tried something like, here's 1 whole and another whole, and that equals 2, that is not a fraction. So there's your non-example. Make sure you get all of that. All right, guys? All right, the next vocabulary word is numerator. In 6th grade, I realize that you've heard these words for the last several years at school. We just have to make sure that we remember what we're talking about in math. So the numerator is the number on the top of a fraction. It indicates how many parts of the whole are counted or shaded. A couple of fun facts that you need to remember. The numerator is always the top number, and in a proper fraction, the numerator is always smaller than the denominator. I wonder where that just went. So, an example of a numerator would be, oh great, now I have to turn on my pen again. All right, so an example of a numerator, let's say we have 7/12 and 5/8. The 5 and the 7 would be our numerators. Non-examples could be something such as 4/9 and 1/2, because the 9 and the 2 are not numerators. So make sure you include those in your notes. The next vocabulary word is denominator. And the denominator is the bottom number of a fraction, and it tells us how many parts make up the whole. And your little facts that you need to know is that a denominator is always, no matter what, it is always the bottom number, and it's always larger than the numerator. So, if we take a look at something like 7 and 7/12 and 5/8, the denominator is the number always on the bottom, and it is also larger than the numerator. Where'd that guy go? It's also larger than the numerator, the number on the top. 12 is larger than 7. 8 is larger than 5. A couple of non-examples could be something like 4/9 and 1/2. And this time, the 1 and the 4 are not denominators. So there's no way that, they're smaller and they're the number on the top. Those would be numerators. They are not denominators. Make sure you get all that in your notes. All right, our next word is improper fraction. And an improper fraction is a fraction in which the numerator is greater than the denominator. So that means the number on the top will be greater than the number on the bottom. A fact to include in your notes is that they can be converted to a mixed number or a whole number to be written in the proper form. So, a couple of examples could be something, or just really one example. Let's say we do, there we are, 7, oh my goodness, I've been making too many of these, 17/7. 17 is greater than 7, which means that 17/7 is an improper fraction. A non-example could be something like 12/13, because 12 is not greater than 13. So that means that 12/13 is not an improper fraction. Okay, we're getting close to the end, guys. We have 2 more vocabulary words left to go. So our second to the last vocabulary word is mixed number. And the definition of a mixed number is a numerical account made up of both a whole number part and a fraction part. So a mixed number is basically a number that is made up of a whole number and a fraction put together. A little fact for you is that a mixed number is the proper form of an improper fraction. So, such as, 1 and 1/8 would be your mixed number, but that's also the same thing as 9. It's equivalent to 9/8. So let's say, another example could be 2 and 3/5 would be a good example of a mixed number, because here is the whole number part, here's the fraction part. A non-example would just be something like 4, because it does not have the fraction part. Or it could be something like 1/4, because it is missing the whole number. So you have your example and your non-examples right here. We have 1 more word left to go. Okay, our last vocab word is equivalent fraction. And equivalent fractions are fractions that represent the same part to whole relationship. 2 different fractions, they just show the same amount of space covered or whatever. So let me see here. I'll show you an example of that. And I really do hope that you're impressed with my awesome drawing here. All right, so on the top row here we have 1/2 and 1/2. But down here on the bottom we have 1/4, 1/4, 3/4, and a 4/4. So we could say, just from looking at this drawing, if we colored in 1/2 and 2/4, that shows that 1/2 is equivalent to 2/4. So 1/2 is an equal fraction, or equivalent to 2/4, shows the same part to the whole as the other one does. A non-example, oh my goodness, let's fix that real quick. A non-example could be something along these lines. Let's try. I'm sure these won't be perfectly split, but we have thirds, 1/3, 1/3, and another third. Then we're going to compare fifths, something like that. 1/5, 1/5, 1/5. And there's our 5/5. 2/3 is not equal to 4/5, let's say. Because if we shade it in 2/3, it's smaller. It takes up less space on here than 4/5. So 2/3 is not an equivalent fraction when being compared to 4/5. So we're done with our vocabulary. And make sure you've got all of this in your notes, and I'll see y'all in class.